There's a couple ways I want to go off of that because there's a good clip gain question which I want to get to, but maybe first I want to translate a little bit of this for some people because again I'm getting a lot of questions that are a little bit more less nuanced, I should say, than some of the stuff we talk about. You know, when someone talks about using like a CL1B, classic Pultec, now Tube Tech, tube compressor. A lot of people use it for vocals. It's a fine compressor. I've used it on stuff before. The reason that, and yeah, you tell me what you think about this. I think the reason I think you don't like using things like that is because you have better ways you have better ways to achieve the things that people think they are achieving with something like that, which is compression and saturation. So a lot of the vintage gear that people like, including tube mics, you know, I use tube mics, I use some tube stuff. The reason people like a lot of that stuff is because you're getting harmonic saturation in addition to whatever else the thing is doing. So a microphone is picking up presumably a great spectrum of frequencies and it's adding harmonic saturation. And that's a really nice thing. If you're going through a compressor, and it's a tube compressor, it's adding some harmonic saturation, and that's a nice thing. But the reason that I think we, especially you, try to avoid using things like that, you don't have anything like that in your studio, is because you can separate out the compression and the saturation with a much more controlled and focused technique. And so you're wanting to achieve the things that people like about having a tube compressor like a CL1B, but you can do it in a much more controlled way. You don't need a box that's just going to do it one way. And so I think that's a thing for people to really understand when we're talking about this stuff. It's not like, you know, we talked about it last week too. Hey, shout out.
That's sick.
We talked about it last week too. You mix plenty of stuff with upfront in your face pop vocals, but you're achieving it using a different set of techniques than most people do. But it's important to understand that, you know, when people talk about compression is a concept. It's a way to limit dynamic range. A compressor is a different thing. A compressor is a particular box that does a particular thing. But you compress with saturation, distortion, different types of harmonic saturation, with a limiter. There's all kinds of different ways to compress the dynamic range of a signal. So anyway, I wanted to sort of get that out there because I feel like we get a lot of questions about that.
Good translation, yeah.
Shout out.
Someone brought up the BG2. I definitely use the BG2. I rarely use it, but I use it actually on this.
What is a BG2?
Highland Dynamics. They make a tube compressor that myself and a lot of homies use. I like it. I used it on this CP I was just talking about. And it was one of the only plugins or hardware pieces on the vocal list that didn't need very much. So I definitely used it, and it just sounds good to me. The needle doesn't move very hard. It just brings the vocal up. It's more about the sound of the saturation in the tubes for me. So I like the BG2 on vocal. I don't use it on anything else. I don't really use any gear on anything else except for the VLC ones by the Hazelrig Fern guys and the Unfair Child. And it's just for the sound, because I like the sound.
Yeah, and people remember too, again, like we talked about a second ago, when if you're not moving the needle on the Unfair Child or the other stuff, it's still doing some amount of processing, which includes some compression because it is saturating.
Yes,
and saturation is, I don't know if saturation is by definition compression, but I guess it's not technically, but it almost always is.
Every once in a while, I think to myself, hey, I'm going to go in and I'm going to overcompress this thing just because people always do it. And then I put it on and I take it off. This sounds better. Yeah. I'm going to try to get away with this. It just sounds more real and also forward. I don't know. There's other ways to do things. That's all. Yeah. We talk about this a lot. I don't want to spend too much time on it.
It's Jon, I don't compress Castelli.
I like your translation though. I don't use a compressor. Of course I compress the waveform with other techniques. I just rely more on exciters and multi-band saturation processing more than I do compressors or multi-band compressors.